Joining us right now for more on this is CNN senior legal analyst, former state and federal prosecutor, Ivey. Ellie, another former pardon attorney called this an extraordinarily broad grant. Why is this so broad, more so than a typical presidential pardon? What do you think of it?
Well, Kate, this is as broad as a pardon can possibly be. Ordinarily, a pardon will specify a certain case, and that happened here. It says, I hereby pardon Hunter Biden on the gun case in Delaware and on the tax case in California. But what's different about this one is it also says this is a full and unconditional pardon for all conduct going back to January 1 of 2014, which means Hunter Biden cannot be federally prosecuted for anything going back to 2014 and really before then, because before then is going to be precluded by the statute of limitations. And as you said before, the only historical precedent, the best historical precedent for this is the pardon of Richard Nixon by Gerald Ford, which has similar language that says full and unconditional pardon. So Joe Biden has pushed to the absolute outer limits of the breadth of the pardon power here.
And as you've heard, in the political sense, there's been a lot of reaction to this quickly, and there will be more today. But looking at it kind of in the, keeping it in the legal sense, past presidents generally have cited how pardon recipients have accepted responsibility for their actions as a reason to grant them a pardon. Biden is not here. He called it a miscarriage of justice that Hunter Biden was unfairly singled out, which is something that we have heard Donald Trump lean into before in targeting the Justice Department and the so-called deep state. Does Biden, in this move here, give Donald Trump new cover for whatever pardon action he decides to take in the future?
To be sure, Kate, we're already seeing that. The first reaction from Donald Trump and his team essentially is, what an injustice. Now we get to do the same thing, which is sort of an interesting twist of logic there. But without question, I mean, look, there has long been a fair debate, fair on both sides, about whether Hunter Biden is being treated overly leniently or overly zealously because of his status as Joe Biden's son. I think there are points to both sides of that. But what I think is not disputable is that this is a historic act of political nepotism. This is the granting of a pardon by the president to his son. Joe Biden even says, if you really parse his statement, he acknowledges that a substantial part of this is because Hunter Biden is his son. And that will land Joe Biden on a historic list that he probably doesn't want to be a part of, along with Bill Clinton, who pardoned his half-brother Roger Clinton, along with Donald Trump, who pardoned Charles Kushner, who is the father of his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So I'm sure Joe Biden understands the historic implications of what he's done, and now he's earned his way onto that list.
I want to read you something that the Democratic governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, posted about this. He's not okay with the move. He wrote in part, "I'm disappointed that he put his family ahead of the country. This is a bad precedent that could be abused by later presidents and will sadly tarnish his reputation." Does this damage the justice system?
Well, I totally agree with the governor that this pardon will tarnish Joe Biden's legacy. I mean, Joe Biden, let's be clear here, he lied to us for a long time. He said categorically, I will not pardon my son. He said, I will take it off the table. And he couched it in very high-minded terminology. I respect the Justice Department. I respect the jury's verdict. Well, now he's gone back on that. I don't know how many people actually believed him. I certainly didn't. There's tape of me saying there's no way he's going to make good on this. He's absolutely going to pardon Hunter Biden. But as to whether this tarnishes the justice system, I don't think I would go that far. I think this, like I said, will go down on the list of ignominious presidential pardons, but I don't think law students 50 or 100 years from now are going to look back at this as a horrific miscarriage of justice that undermines the foundation of our justice system. There is a reasonable argument that in some respects Hunter Biden was treated unfairly, and I think that will give Joe Biden some degree of cover here.
All right, joining us now is Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland. He currently sits on the House Judiciary and Ethics Committees. Congressman, I'm so grateful to have you on the program this morning. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I do want to start with what we learned overnight with President Joe Biden, who decided to pardon his son Hunter, not just for the crimes that he was convicted of and pled guilty to, but for a sweeping 10-year period of time. Did President Biden make the right decision?
You know, I think I've got mixed views about it, frankly. I think that, you know, there is concern that the president legitimately had that the Trump administration and, you know, all this, the retribution tour stuff with respect to the Department of Justice and how he plans to use it against his enemies. I think there's a legitimate concern about what that could lead to. And I think that's part of why the president put in a 10-year stretch for the pardon term, because that should protect him against anything really up to statute of limitations, basically, for most offenses. On the other hand, though, I got to say that even though I don't think Hunter Biden would have been prosecuted under most circumstances, a pardon at this point will be used against, I think, Democrats when we're pushing to defend the Department of Justice against politicizing it, which is certainly what President Trump plans to do, or President-elect Trump. And, you know, the Patel nomination, I think many of the other nominations, it looks like he's going to try and use it in a way to go against and inflict retribution on people. And I think this sort of gives him ground to argue that, you know, both sides are doing the same thing. So I know that there was a real strong sentiment and you know, wanting to protect Hunter Biden from unfair prosecution. But this is going to be used against us when we're fighting the misuses that are coming from the Trump administration.
Very interesting. Sir, you know, for viewers who don't know, you yourself have worked at the highest levels of our law enforcement and legal communities and worlds, including in high-profile political scandals, Whitewater, for example. Do you think that Republicans have any ground to stand on in terms of the arguments that they're making about the Department of Justice? Is there validity to the feelings that they may have about how the department conducted itself in the first Trump administration and since?
No, I think most of that stuff is really overblown, and intentionally so. I mean, it's Trump. The one thing about Trump is it's not new when, you know, politicians are under investigation by the Department of Justice that they say it's political, a witch hunt. Those are phrases that have been used for decades by people in the crosshairs, say like Senator Menendez, for example, who was recently convicted for misconduct in office. The difference here is that twofold. One is a lot of people started believing Trump, and, you know, his MAGA base is, you know, fully on board with the argument that the entire Department of Justice is somehow, you know, an abuse of power and is just running out of control and needs to be, quote unquote, reined in. And I think that's one of the big problems. The other one, though, is that he's going to be the president of the United States and will have full control over the Department of Justice. And, you know, the Patel nomination for FBI, I think, is a bad omen for what he might want to do with that. And his statements about it have been pretty explicit. So it's pretty concerning, I would say. And, you know, what's at risk is the overall rule of law in the United States, which has been a real bedrock for us for more than a century. And we need to fight to preserve that.
Congressman, Democrats did spend, of course, the last campaign strenuously arguing to Americans many of the points that you just laid out. Why, in your view, did Americans vote to put Republicans in charge of the White House and both houses of Congress? And what do you think your party needs to be doing differently going forward?
Well, it seems like the exit interview data that I've seen so far and, you know, the post-mortem polling data seem to indicate that it was really driven by their views of the economy. And I think there were a couple of factors there. One was, I think we spent too much time talking about how good things were from a macroeconomic standpoint. And even though they are, frankly, and, you know, in a lot of ways, the U.S. economy is the envy of the world. But there were a lot of individual people who just weren't feeling it in their daily lives and at their kitchen tables. And so I think they turned to the alternative, and that was Trump, unfortunately. Now, one of the things I think we could have done better there was communicate. I think a lot of times we passed landmark legislation that was helping people and will come to help people. Some of the you know, especially the infrastructure big projects will come to bear, you know, probably in the next year or two. So they take time to roll out, but people didn't know all the particulars, you know, so they heard like initials, you know, ARPA and that kind of thing, but they didn't know specifically what was going to benefit them, with one or two exceptions, like the prescription drug costs for insulin, for example. But overall, I think they didn't really know what we had done, and we didn't do a great job of telling them, and that led them to misunderstand where they stood in the economy and who was going to help them more than the other party. And I think the Democrats have done a great deal to help, but I don't think we got the message across.
All right, Congressman Glenn Ivey, very grateful to have you spend some time with us this morning. I hope you come back on the show, sir.